Welcome to There She Grows podcast, where we are embracing life's twist with a side of wit. I'm your host, Abby O'Sullivan. Welcome back to There She Grows podcast. This episode is all about how to start a podcast. So if you've been curious about how to bring a podcast to life, stay tuned because I'm going to share with you how to do that using There She Grows podcast as the example. And I'm sharing what I consider to be the important parts of creating a podcast beyond the tech, beyond like what microphone do I get. This is the story of There She Grows, the how, the why, and the thought processes behind it all. As it starts for most podcast hosts, there's an idea calling them. You have that little inkling, something burning to be set free. I got the itch to start a new podcast. And if you already know me, you may be thinking like, well, you already have a podcast, Abby, and it is called the Beauty Pro Wellness Podcast. So why start a new one? Well, that is step one, knowing your why. Like, why do you want to start a podcast? I realized that I niched down so much with my original podcast, Beauty Pro Wellness Podcast, that I felt blocked creatively. It no longer felt like the outlet that it used to, and more of a chore, honestly. I still feel some passion for the subject matters of that podcast, but how I produce episodes along with how often is going to change. And going even deeper into it, because that's what we're going to be doing on this podcast. So, of course, I'm going to include that in this episode. Going even deeper into it, fitness, health, and wellness feel like a part of my life that once took up a lot more space than it does now. I don't offer personal or group health and fitness coaching anymore. The only offers that I have are mobility classes that will soon be available through a continuing education platform called Babe. And I am so fine with all of this. Like it's such a relief to have it all figured out. I'm kind of over the whole making it a big business. I want my health and fitness journey to be mine again, more than for promotion of a business. And it's taken me a while to finally come to the point of being able to let it go like this. And it has been hard considering how much I've invested financially, energetically, mentally, and time-wise. But truly, it is that I like to discuss so many more aspects of life that contribute to our overall well-being, functioning, and joy, and just, like being a human. The super niche podcast hasn't felt like a place for me to do that, even if it actually is. As I said to a lash client who has been interested in the fact that I have a podcast because she and her husband have thought of doing one also, if my podcast is so niche and I'm speaking on a topic that more than beauty industry professionals could gain insight from, then would you necessarily find that and follow it if you're not in the beauty industry? Meaning I want to reach more women, all women. I love the beauty industry for what it is and isn't. I realize that it is clever to have a niche podcast when you know your audience so well, especially if you have a business, guys. Yet it simply doesn't resonate with me to fully give my all to just that audience anymore. I want to give value, yet I feel like there needs to be a return on it, or it's not worth it to spend so much time editing, creating clips and content, finding and hosting guests. And I will always relate to being an esthetician and a lash artist. Those titles are not my whole identity, though. Neither is health coach or gym rat or even podcaster, even though I freaking love podcasts. Recently, my life has been a little all over the place, but a clearing of the clouds seems to be happening. A huge weight has lifted off my shoulders from the past few years of craziness. I even started dating again. Whoa. And it has shown me where I still have nervous system regulation work to do, or at least more awareness. It has brought up questions, a lot of them, It has brought some fun and excitement back into my life, and it has made me question whether I actually want to date. Whew. And it has sparked the idea of a new podcast to talk about life experiences and lessons, to bring back the spark of my podcast when I first began and to get even more real. Using your voice, sharing your voice and your thoughts, knowledge, and experiences is powerful. I think it's an incredible catalyst for healing as well. Based on what I know of myself, this is true for me. And as I lean into my podcast management role, I knew starting this podcast would be a perfect opportunity to share the behind the scenes as well. What better way to show you and others how to create a podcast while making content creation more fun for me? So, your why may sound something like, it sounds fun and I've been wanting to. I want to connect with my audience and reach more people in a longer form content format. I want to connect with my audience. I want to connect my audience with my offers using a podcast. I want to collaborate with colleagues by having guests or being a guest. A podcast is an incredible tool for making content creation a bit more fluid. It's an incredible bridge to the next step of working with you or your product offers. And it's an incredible tool for networking, collaboration, and connection that may not happen as easily otherwise. The second step, know your audience and set your expectations. The first part was getting the idea, right? Knowing what I know now. The next part isn't the title, it isn't the tech, it isn't how do I record and get it on Apple. The next step is dialing in on what your podcast is about, the theme, who it's for, your target audience, and understanding the time and effort required to keep up a podcast. So, what's your podcast going to be about? If it's tied to your business, you likely have your concept right there already. You have topics that you frequently talk about and teach on, and the podcast is an expansion of your brand and a place where you can share more at length what you're passionate about. For example, as a health coach, I started my podcast to do just that, share more at length the topics that I was passionate about, that I knew my audience needed or wanted to hear. And I wanted to have guests on to fill in the gaps in my experience and knowledge too, and have fun, really. And then, yes, I also have a built-in place to promote my own offers. Next, who are you making this podcast for? Who are you talking to? When brainstorming this podcast, There She Grows, here's what I wrote down. There She Grows is for women who like an escape, a peek into someone else's life, a juicy story, who question the, quote, rules of how we, quote, should be or have been taught to be, who are unlearning and healing, who pursue growth, personal and or business. Women who desire fun, excitement, passion, safety, to explore. They want to explore. They're curious about how they can tap into more self-love and acceptance, or more sustainable self-care, more balance, if, obviously, if that's even a thing. They want to get to know their bodies and their own innate wisdom. And maybe they're curious about singledom because, hi, I'm your host, perpetually single cut mom. Women who want to use their voice more, speak up instead of sit down and be quiet. Women who know life is a wild ride and sometimes we just have to laugh. No, we need to laugh through the craziness and the tears so that we can keep moving forward, just one little step at a time. And they tune in because they want to feel inspired, less alone, have a laugh, and learn from someone who has been through what they are experiencing in life, love, and business. That's what I wrote down. That's what came out of me when I was like, this is who this podcast is for. And your hashing out of this doesn't have to be that long. It could be more concise. You could know your age ranges and their occupations and all of the demographics and things like that. But this is how I process all of these aspects by brain dumping it onto a page. I like to write, and I also like to use Notion for note taking as well, like especially on the go. Just a little tip. So let's talk about expectations and time next. It's key to understand that creating, recording, and editing a podcast take time. Do you have around 2 hours plus of extra time a week to commit to your podcast? I mean, or more, because for some, it may take more time. If you don't have the extra time or you don't want to do the post show stuff like editing, show notes, uploading, creating social posts, finding guests, like getting them everything they need, can you outsource that? Or consider creating a timeline for yourself to be able to outsource eventually. You'll want to figure out how frequently that you want to release your episodes as well. Do you want a weekly or more than once a week podcast? Do you want biweekly, monthly? You need to go in knowing and understanding all of this instead of just winging it so that you don't pod fade within 5 episodes. Like, I'm really serious about this. You've got to know all these things. That's why I'm making this podcast episode, because you really do have to know these things before you go into it. Otherwise, it can become overwhelming really fast with all the tasks that there are to do. Expectation check. If you go into this thinking that you'll start a podcast and overnight you're going to have thousands of downloads, shares, and people buying your products or wanting to advertise on your podcast, you're jumping in with wrong expectations and possibly the wrong reasons for starting a podcast. Podcasts are a long form and long game effort. Emphasis on the effort. Even if you love podcasting, it does require effort and there's some amount of discipline to get it all done. Go in knowing that you will be learning along the way and refining your process. Go in knowing that as you grow and continue to provide value, your audience will connect with you and stay connected. Plus, you got to promote your show, but that comes later. That comes later. Back to the first steps. Idea, well, we've got that. Check. Audience and theme, check. Episode frequency, check. And now it's definitely safe to think about, if you have a business, how this fits into your business and marketing plan, which you may have done already when you were coming up with the idea. A lot of this stuff can be done concurrently. Step 3 is your title. So let's start thinking about a title. Make sure to Google your podcast name ideas or look them up on Spotify or Apple to see if it's taken, and possibly even trademarked. You can Google how to look up a trademark. You don't want to get attached to a name that's trademark, i.e. unusable, or creates confusion because 5 or more other podcasts are using the same thing or similar. And this is also a really enlightening exercise to see podcasts that have faded, disappeared after 10 or less episodes, sometimes even after the first one. It's kind of crazy. So, depending on how long ago and how many episodes a podcast faded out at, you could chance using the same or similar name. Just check to make sure that it's not trademarked somehow. Some considerations as you're brainstorming titles. How will you stand out? How can you make it easy for your audience to find you? What could they be searching for, like terms that they might search for that you could use in your title, if any? If this applies, if they saw your podcast title, would they want to click on it? What's the title telling your audience about your podcast? Does it make sense with what your podcast is about? Or is it just like an off the wall inside joke that like maybe you and your friends are going to know? Which, I mean, again, this just really depends on what your goals with your podcast are. But if this is tied to your business, I really want you to think about this. So come up with a list of names that you like, say them out loud. Like, this is how I practice. Welcome back to the Beauty Pro Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Abby O'Sullivan. I literally do that so much when I am brainstorming titles. Like when I was coming up with There She Grows, I had The Next Step, or Skipping the Small Talk, or Diary of a single gal in her 40s or something like that. It's like, that's way too long. But this is how I actually do this is I write it all down. I look them all up. I say them out loud. And you've got to ask yourself, do you like the way that it sounds? Does it resonate with you? Do you like that title? And I would caution against asking your Instagram audience or Facebook list for feedback because it's generally that's just way too many opinions unless you are super connected with your audience and you fully trust them. I would give them like the titles that you really love. Like if they choose one that you don't love, like why did you ask them? Ask a few close, trusted, with good taste and possibly even experience in creative or marketing fields, friends or colleagues for feedback so that you can narrow down your options. Originally, what I did was worked with a podcast manager to help me with my launch. Happened to be my sister, who is the co-founder of Wonder Podcast Productions and who has expertise in this field. And she knows how to ask me questions so I can come up with some kind of conclusion. I read articles about women's podcasts. I took note of the names to see what inspired me, like maybe it jogged something else creatively. I thought about the theme of my podcast, the vibes that I wanted it to have. I took my own personality into account. And I wrote all of these things down, just like you listened to me go through like my whole brain dump for who I want There She Grows to be for. This is how I do all of this. So I wrote these things down, I let it swirl in my brain, and I also messaged 2 or 3 other people who I felt could give me really excellent feedback. One friend she just has a really wicked sense of humor, and I just I trust her taste, and she is in my listener demographic. And another one was the founder of a longtime popular lifestyle blog and brand. So I definitely trusted her opinion as well. And I landed on crushing, like crushing the day, life, crappy men, our careers. As I honed in on what I wanted the message of the podcast to be, it was distilling the lessons from our life, sharing need to know self care and health tips with the feel of chatting with your girlfriends at happy hour about everything. When I rebranded the podcast, it was more about a niche. It was niching down. And I simply took the name from a collective, and it was really simple: the Beauty Pro Wellness Podcast. Kind of says it all, right? As I thought about my new podcast title, the one that you were listening to, I considered going back to the OG Crushing with Abby O, but I really wanted something fresh. And I wanted something that is a bit more telling to what the podcast could be about. So I wrote out what I wanted the vibes to be. I wrote out about my audience, as I shared earlier, who they are, why they might listen. I wrote down over a dozen names, looking some of them up to see if the podcast already exists under that name. And if it did, is the podcast current and would it be confused with mine? I crossed some off that gave a negative connotation or sounded too snarky, because this podcast will generally be uplifting. It's going to be entertaining and inspiring with a touch of spice, the hint of sarcasm layered on a velvety base of realness. And this podcast is not to simply complain about life or gossip or talk about what's wrong. I mean, yes, but like not in that way, right? I wanted to be intentional about the words that I chose for the title. So instead of having like no small talk, it could be skipping the small talk. So the word no isn't in there, like a negative connotation already. I narrowed down my list to 2 choices, and I began to play with seeing how they looked in print for my cover art. I also did confer with my sister, who liked the one that I chose. She liked it right away. And honestly, in my gut, I knew it was the one, but I still played around in Canva with both of my choices. And it was between The Next Step and There She Grows. Alrighty, so the next step is content ideas. Now that you've settled on a title, very exciting, I want you to work on coming up with at least 10, or no, let's do like 20 to 30 episode ideas. I want you to give yourself a big head start here so that you have plenty of content to record and keep you rolling on releasing episodes in the timeline that you want. You'll then choose from that list the first 10 episodes that you want to release. as your podcast grows, these will be some of your most listened to podcasts for a while, as people start at the beginning or just kind of bounce around with what you have. If you'll have guests, choose those guests wisely, because again, as your oldest episodes, they may be some of the most listened to episodes. You'll want to get your intros and your outros and your trailer slash introductory episode written and recorded. And if you're going to have music for your intro and outros, begin searching for it. That's actually one of my favorite things. I love picking out music for things. I think that I've always wanted to like be some sort of DJ, like let's go back to the 90s when I used to make mixtapes from the radio when you had to time it just right. If you're a 90s kid, you know what I'm saying. And then we moved on to like LimeWire and all of the downloading platforms. We made mix CDs, and now all we have to do is just like get on Spotify or Apple or whatever and create a new playlist. It's amazing. Although I still have a book of CDs in my car. That's just where it lives. Okay, so back to what we're talking about here, which is podcasts and audio. I'm going to leave some links for you in the show notes, and one of those is to premiumbeats.com. It's from Shutterstock, and that's where you can find all kinds of royalty-free music. So you do purchase it, and then you can use it for your podcast, no problem. It's super fun. You can create little playlists. You can, what I like to do is actually listen to they'll have like 3 different versions, like 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and they'll have all these little loops and things that you can find for each track. And I like to record myself like with my intro over it, and just get the feel for that. Like, what kind of vibes are you going for? Is it more mellow? Do you want something more hype? Like, what do you want for your intro music? The trailer is a brief episode where you're introducing yourself in the show. It lets the audience know who you are and what your podcast is going to be about. What can the audience look forward to? This is a shorter episode that should spark excitement and interest. It's also what you can publish to your host to submit to the directories like Apple and Spotify ahead of your actual launch. It can take a bit of time for Apple to like integrate your podcast, so just keep that in mind. So for your introduction to your podcast, that's what you're going to hear at the beginning of most podcasts. They might have their like little jingle, they have a tagline, maybe they have a shorter introduction where they kind of talk about who they are, what they do, what they're going to talk about on the podcast. So your guidelines are generally you want your intro 60 seconds and under. Your intro should say who you are, possibly your title, who the podcast is for, and what it's about in a very succinct way. It's like the elevator pitch for your podcast. Or maybe you have a tagline that sums it up perfectly that you want to use. Do you have to have an intro? I mean, no, but at the very least, I recommend that you have some specific way of introducing yourself on the show. And I think that it is nice to have some kind of intro, especially when it's tied to your business. For your outro, you want it to be short and sweet. Thank you for listening. Please rate and review if you enjoyed this podcast. Be sure to share it with your friends and family who might also enjoy it. And you can also plug your producer or podcast manager. It's always pretty cool. For your cover art, when you start to you get the title, you get the music, you get your intro and outros done, and then you get your cover art, and it all starts to feel really real, and it gets exciting, like it's all coming together. This is your podcast coming to life. So for your cover art, unless you feel confidently savvy in Canva and with your skills, I recommend hiring it out. Like, let your podcast launch team take care of it. Hire somebody to design it. It truly can suck a lot of time from your days and even cause frustration if you're not nifty in Canva. So you'll want to have your brand portfolio with your color and your fonts, if you know all of that stuff, to send to your designer, or have a really good idea of what you want. In my case, this podcast, There She Grows podcast, isn't exactly tied to a business. I started creating the podcast cover art from scratch, like fonts, colors, everything from scratch. As I said before, I started playing around in Canva when I was trying to settle on a title. And I started with a pre-made bold template I liked the teal color in the font. That was it. And since I was still choosing between two different names, I started creating different versions until a few designs started to look like something I could possibly want. I have a lot of photos from a self portrait shoot that I did for my original podcast. And I was using those, like the remove background feature on Canva. And I was using those photos of myself to, start to put something together. While the idea of setting up another shoot did cross my mind, and maybe I'll still do it one day, I didn't want that to hold me back from getting this part out of the way in the overall launch. If a photo shoot or whatever is something that you need to do or want to do, then get that set up so that you don't hold up your process for your overall launch. Like don't keep putting it off. If you have something that will work, like go for it. So I Googled fonts. I looked up color palettes on Pinterest. I tweaked and deleted and added until I landed on a couple of different versions of cover art. And they were like the two sides of my personality. I had created like the big bold font for the next step, which I was the title that I was considering. And then There She Grows was a more delicate, like cute font. I just really liked that font. And it was definitely like a softer feminine vibe, which my sister noticed. She's like, these are two very different styles. And I was like, well, these are like the two sides of my personality. I just got to figure out how to combine this. She suggested to give her my 10-word description of the podcast. And that little brainstorm sesh helped me narrow down to choose the title. And then she suggested a tagline to help round everything, like really bring it all together. And she threw out a couple of suggestions, and we landed on embracing life's twists with a side of wit, which I just absolutely loved because it perfectly and accurately describes how I talk about most things in life and the vibe that I want for the podcast. I want you to know we'll be talking about life with sarcasm and humor laced in because sometimes that's what gets us through. Plus, it has a rhyme and a cadence to it that I love. Like it's very catchy, Do you have to have a tagline? No, not necessarily. It can be a quick way to introduce your podcast without it taking up too much time, though. So I got my cover art all ready. It was funny because there was one design that I was working on, and I was like, I don't know. I think like this is feeling too after school special. And I actually sent it to my sister. I was like, does this look like an after school special or like a feminine product ad? I was like, I don't know. Maybe there's a good balance of, this badass chick in a black dress and like this delicate feminine font. She goes, well, now I can't unsee it. It's looking like a feminine product ad. I can't unsee it now. And she actually said, hold on, and shared a design with me. And she's like, I don't have as many pictures of you, but I was thinking something more lifestyle. And I was like, oh, I actually have the perfect picture for this, I think. And I brought in some different ones from like all these little photo shoots I used to do. And it is an older picture of me, but it's perfect. And that's what I used for the cover. So I took the design, the font designs that she had put into the one that she sent me, and I changed the picture of it and did all of that. And it's the cover that you see today. And I really, really love it. It's a great picture. It's one of my favorite pictures of myself. Now listen, all of these things, the intro, the outro, even the cover art, these things can be updated as you go. You can rebrand, you can change your cover art. I'm not saying that you want to do it all the time, but do it when it makes sense, Get it all where you love it right now. Get it all where it makes sense right now. And if you should evolve in your show, evolve later down the line, just know that I've done it. You can rebrand and you can change things. So right now, get these done. Make sure you absolutely love them and keep moving. Okay, so let's talk about tech really quick. I'm not going to go super in depth into this. This is not what this podcast episode is for, and you can YouTube and Google all day long. But I've had a Blue Yeti for a long time. It works really, really well for me. The Samson Q2U mics are also highly recommended. You're going to want to make sure you have a stand or the boom arm for your mic, like whatever you want to do for your setup. I record on my laptop. That's the easiest for recording. It's going to a mic with your earbuds or / headphones so you can hear yourself. And your computer are going to be your best setup. If you have to use your phone, by all means, you can do that. Maybe you plug a little mic into it with it. I'm just thinking like, I just want you to get the best recording that you can right off the bat with as little post-production dinking around as possible. You can do a lot of that with the programs that you use to edit. But if you have garbage sound, like too much echo, if it sounds muffled, if it's cutting in and out, like there's only so much that somebody can do in post production for you. So, this is how you get the best recording right off the bat. Sound quality is key. I am actually someone who will tune out if the sound quality is trash or if there's zero editing for pauses and mistakes. I like a clear, easy listening experience, and your show can sound natural and beautiful with editing, and no one will even know. That's what good editing does. People say like, oh, I want it to be authentic and all of that stuff. Like, cool, but we can still sound natural and authentic in ourselves with editing. Honestly, that's how a lot of people do sound really good, is because it's edited. So yes, do invest at least a little in your mic and make sure that your recording environment will be quiet, not echoey. Learn how to use your technology. You know, if there are options for setting like the gain, like on a Yeti. When it comes to recording platforms, there are many to choose from. Personally and professionally, if you are new to audio editing, I'd recommend a platform like Riverside or Descript. They both handle video and cutting clips as well. In fact, Descript is an incredibly robust platform for everything podcasting, audio, and video editing. You can certainly get into the weeds on searching for platforms and trying them out. Give these two a go, or maybe even StreamYard if you want. A lot of people like that one too. You can use Zoom as well for guests. It's easy and most everyone is familiar with it. You're probably going to have the least amount of hiccups with it, even if it's not always like the best video quality. I mean, you could get like a webcam or something for yourself as well. Really just depends on like if you want to use your video, which, you know, when it comes to content repurposing, going ahead and recording yourself doing your podcast, it just makes your content life that much easier. So if we're going to talk about hosting your podcast, this is the platform that sends out your audio file to all of the other platforms for people to listen to, like iTunes and Spotify or the little podcast apps, whatever. Again, you can do some searching. I professionally and personally prefer Buzzsprout. They have low-cost plans. It's easy to navigate, so easy to navigate and get rolling. Like you can do this, okay? There are customizations and dynamic ad placements, and dynamic ads are a pre-recorded audio that you can have inserted into all of your episodes, pre, mid, or post-roll. You can turn them on and off so that you can promote different offers or products for a specific time frame very easily. You'll want to record your first episode and submit it to Buzzsprout or your host and the other platforms earlier than you want to officially launch. Some platforms like Apple, again, can take up to a couple of weeks to get your podcast showing up. And in the meantime, you can keep recording so that you have a few episodes in the tank ready for people to binge as soon as you launch. I purposefully gave myself some lead time to get a few episodes recorded, to tease the release of the new podcast and use the behind the scenes as content as well. I've also had regular work and projects going on, so I wasn't hardcore batch recording every day. Alrighty, that wraps it up for this episode. How to create a podcast based on the creation of this podcast. You can use this as like your template, okay? In the future, I really want to share more about promoting your podcast, like marketing your podcast, monetization ideas, repurposing content, and even private podcasts with you all. But for now, I hope that you've enjoyed this sneak peek behind the scenes of creating and launching There She Grows podcast. Bringing a creative project to life gives me immense satisfaction, and I love helping you launch your dream podcast to share your voice with the world. If you desire support on your podcast launch or managing the production tasks, visit wonderpodcastproductions.com and get in touch with us. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye. Thank you for tuning in to There She Grows podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave a rating and review. And be sure to share it with your friends and family that you know would enjoy it too. There She Grows podcast is lovingly produced by Wonder Podcast Productions.